we are going to talk about principles for process management. Process management is a structured approach for managing business process of a company and can exploit the application of specific principles that refer to the different categories of levers that an organization can use to adopt process orientation. These categories of principles are cultural principles, organizational principles, and management principles. In this lecture, we are going to see in details the cultural principles. Cultural principles consist in a set of tools that aim at facilitating the adoption of a process view within the organization. In other words, cultural principles foster the shift from a function-oriented culture to a focus on the flow and interdependencies among activities and functions involved throughout the process and on customer orientation by acting on organizational culture. Cultural change is in fact one of the most critical aspects of business process management. In particular, there are two cultural principles: pervasiveness of process orientation and customer-supplier logic. Let's start with the pervasiveness of the process orientation. The key point of this principle is adopting a systemic and continuous approach over time to business process management, identifying the main business processes of a company and learning to focusing on the value produced by the processes and their performances and goals. The tools that can help us in adopting this principle are mainly two. First, the mapping of the processes, with a structured and sometimes also graphical representation of the processes of the company. Specific frameworks can be adopted for this mapping, as business process reengineering suggests. The level of details of this mapping can of course differ on the basis of the different objectives. For example, we can stay at a more general level of description if the aim is to identify all the relevant processes of the company. Another tool is the value chain model by Porter that helps in identifying the main activities contributing to the creation of value for the final customer, and consequently it helps in creating an overall view of the processes and of the integration and interdependencies between activities. Using the value chain model is particularly helpful if you wanted to identify which are the processes that are strategic for the organization. The overall goal of this principle is spreading the awareness of the impact of people, work, and activities on the upstream and downstream activities and actors, together with spreading a culture that is process-oriented. Let's now talk about customer-supplier logic. The starting point of this principle, which is also one of the key elements that define what a process is the importance of the final output and of the customer satisfaction. Therefore, the key elements of this principle are deployment of the final goal in sub-goals along the whole process, and the creation of chains of supplier and customers inside and outside the organization. So, for example, if we have as the final goal the delivery of the final product in 15 days to the final customer, we will have to identify sub-goals or specific due time for each organizational unit involved in the process. Due time for the production to deliver the final product to the logistic unit that have to ship the product. Due time for design unit to deliver the requirements and projects needed by the production unit to start the production of the product, and so on and so forth until we assign due time related to the very first activity of the process. In doing so, we activate an internal customer-supplier chain. The logistic can be considered as the client of the production unit, and the production unit can be considered as the supplier of the logistic unit. At the same time, production unit can be considered as the client of the design unit, and so on and so forth. We can use three main levers to apply this principle in practice in a company. First, we can measure interfaces between customer and supplier. For example, we can use service level agreements, which are formal contracts that define, for example, quality and timeliness of intermediate outputs or services exchanged by the supplier and the customer, or transfer prices for exchanging the intermediate outputs. As we said so far, the customer and supplier could be both outside or inside the company. For example, they can be two organizational units of the same company. Measure of interfaces is particularly useful with support processes. Since staff units are typically less involved in the core activities, this lever can help them in adopting a process view. A second lever is the application of a partnership logic. Again, this logic can be applied both internally and externally to the company. Partnership involves the collaboration between the client and the supplier in the realization of the final or intermediate output along the process. For example, the R&D unit and the production unit may jointly develop a new product in order to exploit both R&D competencies on new possible material or technologies and production knowledge about the impact and sustainability of new product production on the current production system of the company. As we can also derive from this example, with the partnership logic, not only there is an exchange of know-how between the customer and the supplier, but also an improvement in efficiency and effectiveness of the overall process. The third level is process standardization, in order to isolate possible exceptions that may occur. For doing so, the different activities and flows must be analyzed and simplified as much as possible in order to have a linear and standard process. In the end, we can say that applying customer-supplier logic allows to increase both responsiveness and effectiveness in satisfying the final customer needs.